Okay, so we're going to get started with exercise 131, which is architectural perspectives. So we're going to do the perspective. It's the last in the 4 major drawing groups. We did the elevation, we did the plan, then we did the section last class, and now we're going to do the perspective. Remember that you're going to turn in 3 of those 4 drawings as your assignment 106. So you're going to pick 3, your 3 best. That gives you a chance to screw one up and not like it and decide not to do it. So that's OK. So you're going to pick the best 3. Make sure that you pick only 3, because if you don't, then I'll just grade the first 3 that I see, if that makes sense. So turn in the 3 that you want me to grade for your assignment 106. Does that make sense? Yeah? So we're going to get started with perspectives. And then next week, 106. It's 106. 107 is the portfolio. Unless I made a mistake. But I don't think so.
We got a handout for 106.
Yeah, there's a 106. So it is due next Monday, the 4th. Due next Monday. All right, so right there. All right, so we're going to start up. Now, previously, on the elevation, on the plan, and on the section, the first thing I did is I went to SketchUp, and I set up my view, and then I exported it. When we get to the perspective, it's actually kind of the opposite. We want to find the photograph first, and then make our building and our sun conditions match what's happening in the photograph. So it's the opposite. If you were having a real site where you got to do a site visit, you would have a photograph. That photograph would then be your guide. Of course, in the photograph, you'd know which direction you were facing. And you'd also know what time of day you shot the picture. So it would be really easy to match the light conditions because you'd have that information because you shot the picture. In our case, we don't have that information, so we have to kind of fudge it a bit. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the Creative Commons search. And I'm going to search Flickr for, let's try Yosemite Meadow. But I would like it if I could find one like this, there we go, that has some water in it. And I'm going to do this on purpose because I want to show you how to do a reflection today. So you don't have to do it with water. You can pick just the plain meadow. There's nothing wrong with that. But these are the kinds of things where I'm trying to teach you a variety of strategies and that sort of thing. You'll find today that I kind of go off on some tangents and just show you stuff because I feel like this is my last chance to throw some stuff at you and see what sticks. So anyway, I'm going to pick something like this as my example image today. Let me go ahead and download the original size. And let me copy it into today's folder here. Oops. There we go. Let me paste it here. Perfect. Now that I have that open, I can either leave it open in Flickr like this, or I can open it up in Photoshop. But I need to have it open before I start worrying about my, hold on a second here, before I start worrying about my SketchUp model, because I have to make my SketchUp model match up with this particular image. So as I look at this image and I start to analyze it a bit, there we go. I've got some shadowing happening here, but let me look over in here. Okay, so there's a shadow from this tree, and it's pretty much straight down. So there's a little bit of a shadow cast right there. So we've got a little bit of the sun on the right kind of coming down that way, fairly high angle. So I want to be aware of that. Furthermore, I want to look at this scene and decide kind of mentally, where does my building fit in this site context? Where do I want it to fit? Is it tipped to one side? What's close to me? What's further away? I'll leave this open, and then I'll open up my SketchUp file. So I happen to already have it open. I'm going to turn off all the section cuts because obviously we don't want a section cut. So let me turn off my section cut so I see my whole building. given that this side of my building is the more attractive side, I'm going to pick that as the side that I'm seeing. I want to make sure that I switch out of my parallel projection back into my perspective. So I'm looking at it. And from here, I need to start thinking about how am I going to line up this building so that it matches up with the photograph. So the temptation is to put one of these on each side like this. The problem is you can't see enough of either image to make it work. So I caution you against that. Keep them both large if you can. And just toggle back and forth between them. There we go. Sometimes because we want to be at approximately eye level, sometimes using this position camera tool, it's a little person with an X next to it. If you use that tool and you click away from your building, it'll get you down to what is more eye level. And it's an easier way than to get yourself into this position to begin with. So as I start to look at this, I may have to use that position camera a few more times here. There we go. I'm going to be looking at this view, and then I'm going to be toggling to my Photoshop file. Do I think that's going to fit? Do I think it's close enough? And I'll go back and forth like this, and I'll kind of imagine how is this building going to work? Does it feel right in my scene? Do I need it to go a little bit further to one side? Maybe like that. And then I'll come back here and look at it again. Okay, it's reasonable. Let me try it. So let me go over to my hidden line style. I'm going to turn off my shadows. I'm going to turn off my guides. I'm going to turn off my axes. I'm going to turn off my section cuts so that we're down to just the plain line drawing. I'll go to File and then Export 2D Graphic. And we'll put it into today's folder. And this is the perspective. I'm going to go into my options, make sure my size is large enough. And I'll say OK. And then I'll export. Now, before I do lots of exports, and also before I even save this scene, even though I emphasize saving the scene before you do the export, I'm going to try it in Photoshop to see if I like it. Because if I don't like it, I'm going to change the scene. So there's no reason to commit to it until I do, in fact, like it. So from here, I'll go to File and then Place, and I'll drop in that perspective drawing. I'll switch the perspective drawing into, we'll just do a multiply, so that I can kind of see it. That might not be easy enough for you guys to see. Let me go back to normal, and then I'll change the opacity so that hopefully you guys can see it a little bit. And then it's a matter of positioning. Do I like it? Does it need to go a little bit more to the side? Do I feel like this belongs in the scene? Yeah, the perspective's not too bad. I've got a few little rocks that can be covered up. It's kind of positioned on the edge of the water. It looks like it's about the right height. OK, I'm pretty happy with it. If I wasn't happy with it, I'd be going back to SketchUp and I'd be adjusting. Because I found out that I do like it, now's the time to save the scene. So I'll go down to my scenes. I'll click on Add New. And it's now Scene 12. Let me rename Scene 12 here, if it lets me. Right-click, Rename Scene. Maybe not. There it is. We'll call this Perspective. All right, so now I have that saved. Now I'm going to go through and do the rest of my standard export options. So I have my lines. If I had guides, I would now switch to the guides view. I don't have any guidelines, so that doesn't help. I may switch into the X-ray mode. So let me go into Styles, and I'm going to go into the Edit tab. I'll come down here under the Face Settings, and I'll go over to X-ray and turn that on. I don't know for sure that I'm going to use this one, but I'm here. It's easy to do the export. I'll go to File, Export, 2D Graphic. This is the X-ray. I'll click Export. We'll turn off the X-ray. Now it's time to get into those shadows again. So let me go to View and then Shadows. And so in my case, because it's the north side of the building, the shadows are going to be a little bit tricky to get to work correctly. So I'm going to spend some time adjusting the time of day. Remember, I said it was likely to be fairly high sun, so around noon, but also it's probably the time of year where the shadows are relatively short. So I'm going to look for about June, and the shadows were on this side. And remember, I'm going back and forth to this Photoshop file looking at the shadows. So there's the shadows. That's about the angle of a tree. So having a little bit of shadow on this side, a little bit of shadow in front, that probably works. There's a shadow that's being cast there. Come back to SketchUp. Maybe a little bit longer shadow, maybe about like that. So I'm going based on the photograph, trying to set the time of day. If you took the photograph, life would be easy. You know the time of day. You know the orientation. It's easier. If you can't get it to match up the way you want it to, remember you could always invert the photograph. You could flip it from one side to the other. You could mirror it, which could make a difference as you go through. So I like this. I'm going to go ahead and turn off. I'm going to go back to the edge settings here, turn off my edges so I have just the colored version. And I'll do an export 2D graphic. And we're going to call this one shadows. And I'll export. Perfect. Now I'll turn off those shadows. So let me go up to View, uncheck Shadows. And I'm going to pick from my sketchy lines the airbrush with endpoints here. Again, turning off section planes, section cuts, and guides. And I'll go to File, Export, 2D Graphic. And this one was airbrush. And then I'm going to do the pen gray if I can find it. There we go. Again, turning off section planes, section cuts, and guides. And I'll go to File, Export, 2D Graphic. So now I've gotten all the various views that I want as part of this. So this is pen. And I'll click Export. Now it's time to line all of them up in Photoshop. So this first one is already set, so that's good. I'll go ahead and commit to it. And now I have it there. Now when I bring in the other ones, I have to make sure that they line up. It's not quite as easy as the last go-around, where we lined up all the pictures first and then brought in the background. So this time I have to be a little bit careful. If I already brought in the line drawing, let's bring in the rest of these. I ended up being pretty close on my, I didn't have to scale it in Photoshop because my view was the right size, so I'm not going to worry about scaling. If you did, you'd have to be adjusting the scale of these as well. I'll commit to this one. I'll go to File and then Place and bring in the next one. There we go. File and Place. And did I get them all? 1, 2, 3, 4. What am I missing? I got shadows, X-ray, airbrush, pen. I skipped pen. There we go. All right, so that's in there. Once all of those are in, remember I'm going to switch all of these to be in multiply blending mode so we can kind of see through it a little bit. And I also want to rename all of these so that they're clean. So I'll call this pen. I'll call this one X-ray. I'll call this one shadows. I'll call this one airbrush. And I'll call this lines. I'm also going to unlock the background, so I'll right-click on background and say Layer from Background. And I'll say OK. So now that's an unlocked layer. So I have all the pieces that I need to start assembling this. So first thing I need to do is to actually cut out for the building so that it stands out in white from the background. And I can do that in a variety of ways. The easiest way to do it would be to turn everything off except for my lines. I am going to change my lines to have full opacity again. Remember, I did that so that I could see a little bit easier. Let me go ahead and use the magic wand here, and I'll select everything going on the outside of the building. That was a relatively easy selection, but I do need to add that tiny little bit that I can see through as part of my building. If I had windows that I could see all the way through, I would be picking those as well. I don't have any in this view, so I'm relatively okay. I'm also going to hold down Shift and add the space that's outside of my standard window here. Okay, so I have all of that set, and I can turn on my background layer here, and I can go ahead and click on Add Layer Mask. So when I do that, it cuts out, and we can have a look and see, does it feel like it belongs in the scene? Okay, it's reasonable. It feels reasonable for this scene. I'm going to have a little bit of trouble with this one rock that's going to be right there, because the building lands on top of that rock. These rocks need to come out in front of the building. So let me make those adjustments right now. Because this is a mask, I can come in and I can paint on that mask. Let me go into my paintbrush, and I'm going to be painting with white. So I flip my colors. Let's make my brush a little bit smaller. Let me zoom in, Control plus to zoom in. And I'm going to kind of generously paint back that section there. Then I will flip my colors again, and I'm going to change my brush to be a hard brush, make it a little bit smaller, oops, like that, and erase everything but the rocks. Okay, I need to make my brush a little bit smaller to get in between those pieces of rock there a little bit. Okay, I'm reasonably happy with those rocks. Now, I will flip my colors one more time to give myself this grass back along there and along there. Now, the other part of this, though, is you see how the line goes across this. And ultimately, this building doesn't feel grounded because the grass doesn't come up and cover up my drawing. So I can help that a bit by taking this and putting it at the very top of my layer stack so that now it's in front, which is good. Okay? So I have that up in front now, but I still haven't done any kind of clone stamping as part of this. So I'd really like to do that clone stamping. Unfortunately, because of the mask, it's not going to let me do a clone stamp in this region, because the mask is going to prohibit, if I do clone stamp in that area, it's not going to work. So at this point, I'm actually going to apply the mask permanently to this image. So I'm not going to be able to go back and make these adjustments and make the rock show through anymore. So I did all of that first. When I'm done, I'll right-click on this and say Apply Layer Mask, which will permanently apply it to the layer. So you see the mask goes away, and it's now cut out. If I turned off the lines, you could see that this is just a cutout. At this point, I can come in with my grass brush. So let me go into my clone stamp. I already have the grass brush selected. Let me zoom in a little bit, and I'm going to turn back on the lines just so you can see it. I'm going to copy from, let's see, I'm not seeing the size of my brush, so I might have to. I'll hold down Alt, copy from, and definitely too big. There it is. Somehow it wasn't reading. So pick approximately the right size brush here, Alt to copy from, and because my grass is relatively short, I'm going to keep the grass short in front of the building. So we'll move our way along here, covering up that front edge. And you can see, if I were to zoom out for a second, that this doesn't feel over here like it belongs in the scene. It's not sitting in the scene yet. And that little tiny bit of uneven grass along there now makes the building feel like it's part of the scene.
Driveways or dirt or anything.
Driveways or dirt instead. You can do the same kind of thing. It's going to be a sharper edge, though, than the grass. The grass is a nice way of blending the two together, which is obviously why I'm choosing to do it. But yes, you can absolutely do it. But notice that I did leave these rocks cut out, and they're in front of the building. So let me continue on here with my clone stamp along this edge. So I'm copying from, and I'll work along this edge. There we go. Alt, copy from, and I'm going to keep copying over into here. Notice I'm going to cover up that little rock. I told you that rock was a bit of a problem. So to make my life easy, I'm just going to cover that up so that that part of the rock goes away. I could do the same thing on this side. I'm not going to worry too much on the back here because if I'm looking over in the back here, I can't really see that edge particularly well. It's so small. That has to do with perspective. When I come out this little piece, though, I may decide that I want the brush to be a little bit bigger when I get to this end because it's coming toward me. And when I go across this section, I do want it to be a little bit bigger. And then when I go back to this, I want it to be a little bit smaller. So we'll go back. I'll hold down Alt. I'm going to copy from over here and fill that piece in. Sometimes you make mistakes, and you went like there. I went over a little bit. I need to go in and make that correction, but I'll do that in just a second. So let me copy from here again, and we'll copy over there. Perfect. I'll copy from it there again, and we'll come in. There we go. I know this is not the most exciting thing for you to watch me do, but it's necessary. So same thing along here. I'll try to do it a little bit faster now. Just covering up that edge. Remember, it's okay if it's a little even. So there I went a little high. It doesn't have to be perfect. There I copied a little bit of the shadow. That's a problem. Let me go back and copy from further over here. All right, so now I've done that. And now suddenly the building starts to feel like it's part of the scene because it has that little bit going in front of it. These rocks did a good job of making it sit down in front of the building pretty well. So at this point, as I continue on, the next step would be to put something in for the glass, some kind of reflection. So I'm looking up at the sky and getting a sense for what's happening in that sky, and I want to make a little bit of a reflection of that. I'll go find that background image from my Creative Commons search. Looking for a similar time of day. Sorry, I haven't found it yet. Remember, one of the big challenges is always finding the right background images. And that can be something that takes even longer to do. This one's actually pretty good. The only problem is the color is a little bit too blue, so I'm going to have to compensate for that. So let me go ahead and download that. Let me show it in its folder. As soon as it's done, there we go, we'll copy it and put it into today's folder. There we go. Back in here, I'm going to go ahead and paste that in. I'll go to File and then Place. I'll drop that in. There it is. I'm using the upper part of it So we'll make it a little bit smaller here. Yeah, probably about like that. I'll go ahead and commit to it. Let me turn it off, and I'll turn off the background for just a second. I'm going to use the magic wand to select my windows. Oops, let me get onto my lines layer, and I'll go through and I'll select all of my window glass, which can be a little bit more challenging now that we're in a perspective because we're seeing through some of these a bit more than we did in the past. I may have to zoom in. Control plus will zoom me in. So this particular window is very challenging because there's so many little pieces. If you can't get it with the magic wand, remember you can also always add to the selection by switching into the rectangular marquee or the polygonal lasso. So you can switch selection methods if you're missing part of it. So sometimes that's a good strategy. Looks like I missed that window. There we go. Now that I have all the windows selected, I can go to my glass here, and I can go ahead and say add layer mask, or sorry, down here, let me add the layer mask. So now that's cut out. Obviously, those are significantly bluer than the sky that's in this image. So I need to compensate for that. So I need to do some kind of a hue and saturation adjustment on this layer. So I'll go up to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Hue and Saturation Adjustment. Control-Alt-G will tie the two layers together. And first thing I'm going to do is drop the saturation a bit. And then I'm also going to lighten it up a bit. A little bit more. So again, this is by eye, but I'm trying to get this color similar to that color. Do you guys see how I'm making that adjustment? So now that those are made, I'm getting my reflection in the glass. I'm fairly happy with it. It's time to bring in some wall textures on this. The other thing that you'll find as you start to build up all of these layers is sometimes it's nice to take things that are similar. So in this case, it's all the windows. Make a folder or a group and call it windows. And then these two items can go inside of that folder, and then you can minimize that. So it's just a way of further organizing subfolders. So I have all of my windows controlled inside of there. I'm going to go ahead at this point and bring in some wall textures. So especially on this wall, I'm not going to do all of my walls because it would take me too long, and you guys don't need to sit and watch me do it. But I want to do it for at least one of the walls. And I'll do it for this big wall because it'll be the most obvious here. So I'm going to bring in a concrete texture for this. I can do a Google search, or I could make my own, or I could do a Creative Commons search. Concrete. I'm putting in tiling texture because I know I'm going to want it to repeat a little bit. And I could find something like this, for example, that's a repetitive pattern. This looks reasonable. Let me go ahead and download this one. I'll show it in my folder. There it is. Let me copy it, put it into today's folder. Perfect. Jump back into Photoshop, and I'll go to File and then Place, and I'll drop that concrete picture in. Obviously, it's way too big right now, so I'll hold down Shift as I make it smaller. And I want to pay attention to how large are these panels and how many of those should be on this wall going vertically. So in this case, there's 3 of those panels. I'm guessing that those 3 are about the full height of this wall. So I'll come over here, I'll make this a little bit bigger. Okay, that seems about right in terms of height, just on that front edge. Once that's done, I'll go ahead and say OK. If I felt like I needed more going back, I might need to make a copy of this. So let me take it, just rectangular marquee, larger than, edit, copy, edit, paste. I'll get a second version of it. I can then use the move tool to align that right there so they tile together. So I get a longer wall of those. I want these two pieces to be merged into one layer. So right now they're this layer and this layer. I want them to become one layer, so let me select them both, right click and say merge layers. They then become one layer. I'll go ahead and rename this concrete. And I'll also rename it concrete 1 because theoretically if I was doing this I'd have multiple sides of concrete. So there it is. But unfortunately it doesn't line up with the wall that's behind it. Let me go ahead and adjust the opacity a little bit so you can kind of see it. Obviously this is straight. I could do a clipping mask on this without much of a problem, but it wouldn't feel like it was in perspective. So I need for it to change so that it feels like it's in perspective. So I'm going to do this by going up to my edit and then transform. And you guys remember that skew that we used before? I'm going to go ahead and use skew. And this is going to let me control the corners. And essentially what I want to do is I want to make this line line up with the edge of my perspective. It's also going to need to be a little bit shorter. So it's going to need to be about like that and about like this. Furthermore, this is going to have to come back up and line up with the bottom edge. So let me zoom in here so that hopefully you can see it a little bit better. See how that top edge is lining up, hopefully, with the top edge of the building there. Likewise, the bottom edge, I only have a short little bit of the building there, but I need this to come down a little bit because I'm lining up that bottom edge there. So this texture now is starting to be in perspective. I want this line to end up being relatively vertical and this line here to be relatively vertical so that it matches up with the wall. If I wanted more of these panels to show up on this wall, I would be shortening this. And as I shorten it, you can see that more of those panels are lining up on the wall. So it's a matter of visually how many of these panels do you want on any given wall. Okay, so I have those. I know there's these little form tie dots. I don't really want those showing. I either want them for sure showing or not showing. Let me check down at the bottom. Okay, it looks pretty reasonable. I'm happy with the perspective. I'll go ahead and commit to it. Perspective's there. Let me make it fully opaque for a second. Now I need to do the mask on this layer. So let me come back to just my line drawing. Zoom out, Control minus. And I'm going to select just that wall. I can then go to my concrete layer right there, and I can click on the Add Layer Mask. Oops. Sorry. Wrong layer. There we go. Add Layer Mask. And now that's cut out and is part of that side wall. So you guys see how I changed the texture so that it's along the side. I can do the same thing for one of the other views just for purposes of showing you here. I'll do it across this whole front and up there. Once again, I'll go to File and then Place, and I'm going to bring in that concrete texture. There it is. Let me zoom out. Again, I'll adjust my size to be appropriate. So in this case, it's probably more than just these three. So I'll commit to that. Then I will select it with the rectangular marquee, edit, copy, edit, paste. I'll move this so that it lines up below. Control V to paste another section. Control V. There we go. One more. Better to have a little extra. All right, so all of those together, they made a bunch of layers. Remember, I'm going to select all of those layers, right-click on them, and say Merge Layers, so they become one layer. I'll call this layer Concrete 2. Concrete 2. And now I need this one to be in perspective. So same thing, I'll adjust the opacity a bit so we can see through. And then I need the perspective to start being set up for this. So first off, I'm going to make this a little bit taller so it's more centered. And then I'll start working along the bottom perspective. And I need to pay attention to where the breaks are in the building, what are coplanar and what aren't coplanar. So in this case, I'm coplanar with this surface down here, this surface here, up and then over and back down, not this surface because it's stepped back a little bit. It may not matter when I do it. It still may texture out just fine, but it's something to be aware of. So first off, we'll go into Edit and then Transform and then Skew. I like Skew because it's easier to control what's happening. So first off, let me shorten this up so that it's more the size of my building. We'll shorten that up like that. Then I need to start lining up with that line that goes along the bottom there. So let's adjust this. So it's not nearly as steep as that perspective was. So we're going across that line there. That's about right. This one here is about there or so. This is taller than that. So I can't just do a line straight across. So let me just say it's about like that. Now that I have this, I'll go ahead and commit to it. That whole wall is now in perspective. Let me turn off the other concrete. Turn off the background here. I'm going to turn off the concrete itself. Now I'll go through and I'll use my magic wand and I'm going to select, oops, on the lines layer. I'm going to select this face, that, and that, for example. Then I'll go back up to my Concrete 2 layer and say Add Layer Mask. And that concrete is now on that section. So if I turn that and this on, you can see that I'm starting to build out these in their proper perspectives. So this does take some time if you really want to do this, and especially if you want to do it for every surface of your building. It's not necessarily required. You could get away with just the line drawing. It depends on how, quote, photorealistic you want it to be. And you have to decide what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. You can look at a variety of examples online and decide at what point do you stop. At what point does it want to be photorealistic? At what point does it want to be a hybrid between a drawing and a photorealistic piece, etc. So anyway, I have the windows. I have the walls. I can turn the windows back on. There they are. I may also want the windows to be multiplied so that we see a little bit of what's happening on the other side. That might be useful. I'm going to make a folder with the walls here, so I'll select these two layers. I'm going to create a new group here. We'll call this Walls, and I'll take these two into the Walls layer. We may also find that the walls really need to be lower in the layer stack. So maybe they need to be down here so that when we turn on the other line drawings, they can see the line drawings over the top of the walls a little bit more. I'm going to leave the X-ray off. It's a little strong. There we go. So we have a little bit of line drawing over the top of it, so it reads a little bit more like a line drawing. So now if I were looking at it with the background context, we could see it in its scene. I've started to apply the textures on my wall here. Next thing would be to add the shadows in. So there's the shadows. They're not reading on top of the ground because of the order of the layers. So let me take shadows and bring it up to the very top here. There we go. Now they're reading on the ground. Just like we did with people, though, this edge of the shadow isn't grass edge. It's sharp, as if it were on pavement. So I need to go in and I need to make that blend in correctly. Furthermore, I need to make some adjustments on top of where the rocks are so that the shadows fall naturally along those. So I'm not going to do it for everything, but I'll show you real quick the strategy here. Let me turn everything off except for the shadows. I'm going to go into my clone stamp with my grass brush. Oh, it's not going to let me do it because it's a placed image. I'll right-click and I'll say rasterize layer. Now an operational layer. Let me zoom in here a little bit. I'm going to copy from white, and I'm going to soften that edge. Make this a little bit bigger so you guys can see it there. And if I were to turn on the background, you can start to see that now the shadow feels like, instead of being that sharp line, it feels like it belongs naturally in the grass. So I can continue going through here, softening up that edge. On the other side of it, back up in here, I would be copying from the gray and doing it so that the shadows are sticking up on the back edge. I'll copy from over here, and we'll drop those in there as well. So we did this, if you remember back when we did the people, when we inserted the people into the grass, we did the same thing, where we were trying to manipulate the shadows. So same strategy exists here to make the shadow feel like it's part of the ground as well. I also have to pay attention to the shadow and the darkness of the shadow. Does it match up with the other shadows in the scene? Looks like the other shadows in the scene are a bit darker. So I either need to take this and duplicate it. Oops. I think I said delete instead. To make those shadows a little bit darker. Or I need to go in and on the shadows layer do an adjustment. So layer, new adjustment layer. I'm going to do a levels adjustment on it. Control-Alt-G to tie only to the shadows. And then we're going to darken up the shadows. Now, unfortunately, when I did that, I need to get rid of the white because it's darkening up the white right now. And I don't want that to happen. See how it's darkening up that scene? We don't want that. So it was probably a better strategy, instead of doing that levels adjustment, I could delete the white or mask off the white. But I'll just duplicate the shadows layer until it's dark enough. So there may be one more duplicate layer. Yeah, now the shadows are starting to feel like they're the same darkness. So you want to make sure that that part works out. Let me turn back on some of my line drawings so that you can see it in contrast. Let me turn back on my windows, turn back on my walls, and now you're starting to see it materialize here. Okay? So maybe the shadows, maybe I don't like the shadows, maybe it's too much. You have to kind of play around with this stuff. It's starting to feel really dark to me, and I don't really like it quite so dark, even though the shadows in the scene are dark. So let me go ahead and go back to where there's just one level of shadow, and I'll deal with that. But again, it doesn't match up quite as well, although on the projector it looks better than it did. Okay, so I have the shadows on now. Now it's probably time to put a person into the scene. So I'll go to File and then Place, and I'm going to drop a person into the scene. I believe I had one from last class. Right? I have to decide, do I want black and white, color, how do they fit in the scene, what's appropriate. Go to File and then Place. Remember that eye level should be approximately at the horizon. So now that her eye level is approximately at the horizon line, I can make her further into the scene or closer to us, depending on where I place her. Does that make sense? As long as those eyes stay in the same plane. So do I want her, walking over to the building? Is the shadow correct on her, for example? Not quite. So I really should flip this over so that she has the shadow on the correct side. Something like that. I could also go into, instead of doing it the way I just did it, I could go to Transform, and then I could flip. I think it's vertical. Nope. it's flip horizontal. But the point is you could do that instead. Once you have her placed the way you want her, right? She's a little short. She needs to be a little bit taller there. You have to make some adjustments. So in this case, eye level is obviously close to that horizon line. But depending on if she was in the building, she'd be a little bit higher. Since I want her coming out of the water here, she needs to be a little bit lower. So it's a little bit of a visual adjustment. You have to decide where she fits into the scene. There she is in that particular place. I'll go ahead and commit to her. There she is. She happens to have her shoes off, so coming out of the water might work. I don't know why she'd be swimming in this outfit, but such is life. I might maybe make her a little bit down, just a little bit more, like that. Now, she's here. If I were to look at her feet closely, just like we did way back when we integrated people into scenes, a little bit of that bank grass needs to be up over her feet so that she feels like she's part of it. So this time, because she's on top of everything else, actually the cutout is not the best either, but since she's on top of everybody else, I'm going to make a selection right there of the background. There's the background. I'll copy it, edit, copy, and then edit, paste, and put that on top of everything else. Turn everything else off so you can see it. All right, so there's that background. First thing I need to do is cut out where her feet go on this layer. So I'll magic wand like that so that I get where that is. I'll then select inverse, move up to my background copy here, delete it so her feet are showing. And essentially what that left me with is a hole in this little piece of ground. I can then go into my clone stamp tool. Again, I have the grass brush. I'll hold down Alt to copy from this green, and we'll cover up the bottom of her feet just a little bit like that. And then when I turn her back on, she's now nested into the grass just a little bit. So it's those kinds of little details that can sell this fake scene. So now that she's in position here, if I were to turn back on everything else, except maybe those extra shadows, we can see that she's in the scene, Control 0. Now she's part of it. And she's at the approximate right scale. The shadow is on the right side of her. So all those little details matter as you start to do this. Okay, so I have those things in. The things that I don't have yet are the reflections into the water, which I told you I'd show you how to do the reflections into the water, because these are the kinds of things that ultimately people like to do. So I need a reflection of her in the water, and I'm going to pick her because she's one layer and it's easy. If I'm going to do the reflection of the house, I have to make sure I'm at a place where everything is ready to be merged into one layer, because when you do this reflection, I need an exact version of the scene to do the reflection with. You could do a save, like a save for web or a save as, and get a JPEG and then bring the JPEG in. But in this context, I'm going to do it with just the lady so that you can see it without too many extra steps. So there she is, the woman walking. I'm going to go ahead and rasterize her so that she's embedded in the scene. And then I'm going to duplicate the layer with her on it. Then I'm going to go to Edit, Transform, and I'm going to flip vertical. Then I'm going to use my move to move her down so that she's being reflected in the water. Now the cool thing about reflections, when you photograph a reflection, is the scene mirrored. There's no perspective to them. There's nothing you have to skew. It's relatively simple to get it. The only thing that can change is how tall somebody is versus where the mountains are, for example. So if I imagine the horizon line here and I did the reflection, her head is actually going to be a lot lower in the reflection. It's going to be more like down there because of the angle of the camera. So you have to interpret a little bit of that. In reality, she might even be a little bit further down, but I wanted to show you enough to make the reflection worthwhile. This one, we'd get more of the bottom of the building showing down in here. So there she is. Let me look at her for a second. obviously, the double legs, the legs that are sticking up here, that's not helping me. So let's go ahead and erase off, right, the back half of her. So let me come down. Let me rename this. This is woman reflection. There we go. And I'm just going to use the eraser tool, and I'm going to erase her right to the water line. So right there is approximately the water line. If you're struggling to find where that water line is, remember you can always take her reflection, make it a little bit more transparent so you can figure out where that water line is. Okay, so now that I have this, a couple things about the reflection. One, the reflection isn't perfectly sharp anymore, right? So I need to make that piece not so sharp. So let me take this particular layer, and I'm going to add a little bit of a blur to it. So let me go up to my filter. I'm going to go to blur, and I'm going to go to Gaussian blur. And there she is. If it would let me give a preview. Come on, preview it. And I have to decide what the radius of the blur is going to be. So let me go down to maybe 0.1, and I'm going to slowly drag this up. And I'm looking for a blur that matches the blur here. Does that make sense? So I'm visually looking here. There's a little bit of blur. It's maybe a little sharper. Yeah, about like that. I'll go ahead and say OK. And now it's not nearly as sharp anymore. There's a little bit more to it, though, because the water kind of streaks the color a little bit. So to mimic that, I'm going to go in and let me find the tool here. There we go. There's something called the Smudge Tool. So I'll use the Smudge Tool, and I'm going to drag through her with the Smudge Tool to create some of these little waves. And this takes a little bit of practice, right, so that she becomes blurry as part of the reflection. Does that make sense, how I did that? So it's a little bit of smudging. I may need to adjust the radius of my smudge. It might have been a little fat for what I was doing. I might have needed a little bit smaller. But now if we step back and you look at it, she feels like she's even more part of the scene because she has the reflection in the water. So we do the same thing with the house, same strategy, where we take the house and then reflect it down here. The challenge with that is, like I said, combining the layers together. So you either have to combine all the house layers together, or you need to do an export of the scene, cut out the background, drop the house in with everything applied to it. Okay, so it's a little bit more complicated, and I don't want you to have to sit here and watch me go on and on and on. So she's in there, same strategy for doing the reflection. The other thing that sometimes people like to do is they like to activate the upper side of one of these scenes. You can do that using something called a bird brush. If you do a Google search for Photoshop bird brush, these are brushes that let you drop in birds, essentially. There it is. Let me extract it. There it is. There's the brush. And let me go into my preset manager. This is a lot like when we did the swatches and we loaded those in. I can go into my brushes, and I double-clicked on it, and it already loaded the brushes for me. So life was easy because of that. Essentially, what I can do now is I can go to my paintbrush. I'm going to paint in black for this because it's just going to be a silhouette. And then I'm going to look at the bottom for my birds, which of course conveniently didn't show up. There they are. There's my birds. And I can decide what bird is appropriate. Maybe it's this bird. And essentially you can get a preview of the bird and make it a little bit smaller. maybe like that, and you can drop a bird in. You could pick a different bird and drop it somewhere else. There also have birds where it's like a flock of birds. So something like this, and you could paint in a flock of birds. Obviously, if you like put lots of birds in, something's wrong, so you might not want to have that many birds. But I at least wanted to show you that that's something that you could choose to have part of your scene, a little bit more interest as part of your scene. It works rather nicely as a silhouette. Sorry, let's step back a little bit more. There it is. You know, maybe they're after something over there. So you can choose to do that. There are things like tree brushes where if you wanted to bring in trees, you could do that as well. But this is essentially what we're going for. I'm going to keep the X-ray off because I think it's a little bit too strong. I may need to adjust the windows. I think I might need a second window layer here. Go ahead and duplicate this layer. There we go, just to darken up the windows a little bit now that the shadow's on. And then I'm going to kind of step back and look at the scene. Am I happy? Did this feel integrated? Is it the right combination of a drawing and or a photograph? Is it reasonably photorealistic? Yeah, okay, I'm happy. This is going to be my version. Okay, so that's the goal today. I want you to try to get the perspective view into a scene, make the perspective match, add a person. You don't have to do it with water. You don't have to do the silhouette or the reflection. I just wanted to show you that that exists and that you can do it. You don't have to do the bird brush. Again, that's an optional thing. But putting some textures on might not be a bad strategy. I'd like to see that you know how to do the Skew tool and can get it into perspective. If you're struggling because you don't want to do all of the materials that are in the building, I understand. Your building could look just fine without those pieces. So for example, I have this view. Let me turn off my concrete, if I can find it. Thank you. Walls. Right, I turn that off. Maybe I even turn off that one more shadow, and it becomes more of a line drawing that's in context. Okay, so this one doesn't have those dark shadows. It doesn't have the concrete textures on it, but it reads. I still have the windows, so I get a sense for there's glass. This is more of a drawing that's been dropped into scene. It's obvious that this is something I'm adding to the scene. This is my new design. This can work great in an architectural presentation. It doesn't have to be photorealistic. And so it's important for you guys to decide how much is enough and how much is too much, and is this going to sell my building in the best possible way? Okay? So I like to point out that there's nothing wrong with this either. Yeah?
Use the pictures that already have people in them?
Yeah, you can absolutely use pictures that already have people in them. I know there's one that's floating around. If you type in Yosemite Meadow, I've seen it a billion times. The key there is making your building feel like it belongs with the people walking. I'm trying to figure out where it is. Yeah, of course, now it's not going to show up. It's that one. Of course, I can't see it. Yeah, here's one where you have a person in the scene. Okay, so something like this. Could you put your building into this? Sure, but it's a little tricky because that person is very much in the foreground. Your building has to be smaller toward the background, but it also has a bunch of these taller grasses because the camera angle is below eye level in this. So it's like waist-high grass. So the challenge of cutting out those individual grass stalks and whatever becomes really hard. So something like this, even though the person's already there, and I don't have to worry about doing the shadow or integrating the person, I think this would be harder than putting the person into a scene that didn't have all this. So you just want to be selective as you're going through and picking which one feels appropriate. You have to pay attention also to things that have, this one's obviously too close up anyway, but trees are difficult to deal with. They have to match up with your scene. They have to be the right scale if they're there. And then you may have to cut out and around certain tree branches and that sort of thing, though that can help integrate you into a particular scene. Something like this, you could technically put the building in here behind this tree, but you'd be showing through these trees and these tree branches to your building, which makes it well integrated, But think about trying to cut out all of those individual needles. Remember the refine edge tool we went through? How do you do that? We will be doing that on this as well. So you want to pay attention to all of those things and pick an image that makes it make sense and makes it a little bit easy to do it. Trying to think what else. You know, same thing with one of these boardwalks, something like that, where you have that. You could end up putting your building in there. Obviously, this one's copywritten, so you know, don't pick this one. But you could put your building in there with the walk winding around it. I mean, those are options as well. Think composition, how your building fits. Notice when I set this one up, I set up my building to be on this 1/3 line, and I set up my person to be over here on this 1/3 line. Small little things. That went back to the photography part of the class. So all of those things should be floating around in your head all the time when you set these things up. Are there any questions about the perspective? No? All right. So remember, your assignment is due on Monday. I will have grade sheets done for you guys on Monday as well, so you'll get fresh grade sheets. If you haven't caught up on exercise and whatever, try to catch up because I'm going to be doing the grade sheets. If you do get caught up over the weekend, I probably will have already done the grade sheets, in which case we'll have to update it again. But I want you guys to know where you are essentially a week before the final so that you can get everything kind of wrapped up. All right?